The Farmer brothers' terrible sexual practices left 53 Ozark widows dead or missing. All of them promised new lives as wives. That's what the hidden records show. In 1893, 3 wealthy brothers in Tennessee's Cedar Hollow had a system. They found desperate widows. They promised marriage and security. They delivered slavery and death. When journalist Elena Whitmore arrived to investigate reports of women who'd mysteriously moved away, she found their wedding rings abandoned in the forest, their belongings scattered like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. The town called it romance. Elena called it hunting. Jeremiah Farmer quoted scripture while his brothers Ezekiel and Solomon handled the dirty work. The church stayed quiet. The law looked away, and somewhere in those mountain shadows, graves held women who'd believed in second chances. But here's what haunts the darkness. The entire community knew. They watched widows disappear one by one. Year after year, they heard the screams echoing from those remote farms. So why did 53 women have to die before anyone dared to speak the truth? The train wheezes to a stop at Cedar Hollow's modest platform, releasing a cloud of steam that momentarily obscures the mountain town's weathered facades. Elena Whitmore steps onto the wooden planks, with her leather satchel clutched tight against her chest, the September air of 1893 carrying the scent of wood smoke. And something else, something she can't quite place, but that makes her skin prickle with unease. She has traveled from Nashville, following whispered reports that have filtered through women's circles like smoke through cracks in a wall. Stories of widows who have found unexpected second chances in this remote Tennessee hollow. Women who have arrived, broken and desperate, only to discover new purposes as wives to prosperous local men. The town spreads before her like a pastoral painting, all neat white houses and church spires piercing the canopy of turning leaves. Yet Elena's trained eye catches details that sit wrong. Windows watch her with an intensity that feels personal, as if the entire population has been waiting for her arrival. When she approaches the general store to ask about lodging, conversations die mid-sentence, leaving only the creak of floorboards and the tick of the wall clock to fill the silence. "You'll be wanting the boarding house, I expect," says the clerk, a thin man whose hands tremble slightly as he wraps her purchases. Mrs. Carmichael runs a clean establishment, serves good meals. His eyes dart toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk through it at any moment. "Though I can't say how long you'll be staying. Most visitors don't find much to keep them here in the hollow." Elena smiles with the practiced warmth she uses to put sources at ease. "I'm actually here about some of your recent residents. I understand several widows have found new lives here recently. I write for the women's pages, you see. Stories of hope and renewal are so popular with our readers." The man's face goes carefully blank. "Can't say I know what you mean, miss. We don't get many newcomers. Folks here tend to keep to their own business." But Elena has interviewed enough reluctant sources to recognize evasion. She thanks him and makes her way to the boarding house, noting how curtains twitch in windows as she passes, how conversations on front porches cease until she moves beyond hearing range. The boarding house itself sits at the town's edge, a sprawling Victorian with gingerbread trim that should have looked welcoming but instead reminds Elena of a mouthful of broken teeth. Mrs. Carmichael proves to be a rail-thin woman, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seems to stretch her features. She shows Elena to a small room on the second floor, her movements quick and nervous, like a bird expecting predators. "Breakfast is at 7, supper at 6 to you, no gentlemen callers, payment in advance." She pauses at the doorway, her knuckles white where they grip the frame. "Might I ask, what brings you to our little town?" Elena repeats her story about writing uplifting pieces for women's publications, but Mrs. Carmichael's expression only grows more guarded. "I'm particularly interested in the success stories I've heard about widows finding new marriages here. Mary Patterson, for instance, and Rebecca Thornton, such inspiring tales of second chances. The colour drains from Mrs. Carmichael's face so completely that Elena fears the woman might faint. "I don't know those names," she says, but her voice cracks on the lie. "If you're looking for stories, perhaps you'd best look elsewhere. Cedar Hollow is a quiet place. We don't have much truck with outsiders or their interests." That evening, Eleanor walks the town's main street as shadows lengthen between the buildings. The few people she encounters offer polite nods, but quickly find reasons to duck into shops or turn down side streets. She is beginning to think her sources in Nashville have been mistaken when she notices a narrow path leading into the woods behind the church. Something about the way it disappears into the darkness calls to her journalist's instincts, and despite the cooling air and approaching night, she finds herself following it. The path winds through stands of oak and maple for perhaps a quarter-mile, before opening into a small clearing where autumn moonlight illuminates the forest floor. Elena is about to turn back when something glints near the base of a large boulder. She kneels and brushes away fallen leaves, her fingers closing around a delicate gold band set with a small diamond. Even in the dim light, she can make out the inscription inside, "To Mary, my eternal love, J.P." The ring is pristine, as if it has been carefully placed rather than lost. A branch snaps somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing. Eleanor straightens, her heart hammering as she strains to see into the shadows. "Hello?" she calls softly, but only silence answers. She slips the ring into her coat pocket and hurries back toward town, the sensation of being watched prickling between her shoulder blades with every step. Back at the boarding house, she finds Mrs. Carmichael waiting in the parlor, despite the late hour. The older woman's face is drawn with an expression Elena can't quite read, fear perhaps or resignation. "I thought I should mention," Mrs. Carmichael says without preamble, "there is a woman you might want to speak with, Sarah McKinnon. She's a widow herself. Came here about 2 years ago. She understands things. You'll find her at the schoolhouse tomorrow morning. She helps with the children's lessons." Elena thanks her, but Mrs. Carmichael is already retreating toward the stairs. At the bottom step, she pauses without turning around. "Miss Whitmore, whatever you think you're looking for here, be careful how deep you dig. Some truths are buried for good reason." Alone in her room, Elena examines Mary Patterson's wedding ring under the lamplight. The inscription is dated just 3 months earlier. Yet, according to her sources, Mary has left Cedar Hollow to start her new life nearly 6 months ago. She thinks of Mrs. Carmichael's warning, of the fear she has seen in every face she has encountered, of the way the entire town seems to be holding its breath. As she finally drifts towards sleep, one question circles through her mind like a persistent echo. If Mary Patterson has truly found happiness with her new husband, why is her wedding ring abandoned in the woods like a grave marker for something that should have been a beginning? Elena finds the schoolhouse at the edge of town, a modest wooden structure with windows that let in the morning light in long golden shafts. Inside, a woman with auburn hair pinned neatly at her nape is helping a group of children with their arithmetic, her voice patient and gentle as she guides small hands across slate boards. When the children are dismissed for their noon meal, the woman approaches Elena with cautious eyes that hold depths of knowledge no school teacher should possess. "You're the journalist Mrs. Carmichael mentioned," Sarah McKinnon says, her voice carrying a slight tremor that speaks of carefully controlled fear. "She said you were asking about the women who've moved on from Cedar Hollow." Sarah's hand smooths her dark skirt, a nervous gesture that Elena has learned to recognize in people carrying heavy secrets. "Perhaps we should walk. The woods have ears in this town, but sometimes the open air offers safer conversation." They make their way along a path that skirts the town's edge, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet, as Sarah remains silent for several minutes. Finally, She stops beside a stream that chatters over smooth stones, her gaze fixed on the rushing water as if it might wash away whatever she's about to reveal. "I came to Cedar Hollow 2 years ago," she begins, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband had died of consumption, leaving me with debts that swallowed everything we'd built together. I heard tell of opportunities here, of men who valued companionship over dowries, who could offer security to women like myself." Elena withdraws a small notebook from her satchel, but Sarah's sharp look makes her put it away immediately. "Within a week of my arrival, I was introduced to the Farmer brothers," Sarah continues, her breathing growing shallow. "Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Solomon. They own most of the good land here, and they have a reputation for charity toward desperate women. Jeremiah, in particular, seemed taken with my situation. He quoted scripture about providing for widows and orphans, spoke of God's plan for giving broken women new purpose." The stream gurgles past them as Sarah's composure begins to crack. "He courted me properly, or so it seemed, brought me little gifts, spoke of marriage and the home he could provide. The whole town approved. They said I was blessed to catch the attention of such a godly man." Her laugh holds no humor whatsoever. "I was to visit his farm to see where I'd be living as his wife. The property was remote, miles from town, up winding mountain roads. Beautiful, he called it, peaceful." Eleanor feels her chest tighten as she recognizes the pattern emerging from Sarah's words. "What happened when you got there?" Sarah's hands tremble as she pulls her shawl closer around her shoulders. "The house was grand enough, but something felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. There were women's things everywhere, clothing, hairbrushes, jewelry, but Jeremiah said they belonged to his late wife. Too many things for one woman, though. Different sizes, different styles. When I asked about it, his whole demeanor changed. The kindness disappeared from his eyes like someone had blown out a candle." The autumn wind rustles through the trees above them, and Sarah glances around nervously before continuing. "He told me then about the true arrangement, how I'd be working his land, keeping his house, serving his needs and those of his brothers when they required it. How I'd signed papers that gave him rights over my person and property. How no one would come looking for me because everyone in town believed I'd found happiness." Sarah's voice breaks completely. "He showed me a room where he kept other women, 3 of them, thin as rails and broken-looking. They wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't speak above a whisper. One had bruises on her throat in the shape of fingers." Elena's blood turns to ice in her veins. "How did you escape?" "By the grace of God and my own desperation," Sarah says, wiping tears from her cheeks. "That first night they locked me in with the other women. One of them, Rebecca Thornton, managed to whisper warnings before Ezekiel came to check on us. She'd been there 8 months, she said. The woman beside her had tried to run twice and been brought back both times. Rebecca told me there was a loose board in the floor of the root cellar where they sometimes made us work. If I could get there during the day, I might be able to slip away." Sarah's breathing becomes rapid and shallow as she relives the memory. "It took me 3 days to work up the courage and find the opportunity. When I finally crawled through that gap in the cellar floor, I ran through those mountains like the devil himself was chasing me. And maybe he was. I could hear them searching for me, calling my name, promising they'd be gentle if I came back willingly." She shudders. "I made it to a neighboring county before I dared stop running. Took me months to find the courage to return, and only because I couldn't bear the thought of other women walking into that trap." Elena's mind races with the implications of Sarah's account. The women who supposedly found new lives and moved away are still there, if they were still alive at all. Sarah finishes grimly. "Jeremiah has a way of making people disappear when they become inconvenient, and the town helps him do it. The sheriff's in his pocket. The preacher takes his donations. The merchants depend on his business. Everyone knows, Miss Whitmore. They all know. And they all look the other way because the farmer brothers have made themselves too important to challenge. As they walk back toward town, Elena's thoughts churn with the scope of what Sarah has revealed. This isn't simply a case of missing women or even isolated abuse. This is a systematic operation protected by an entire community, willful blindness, and enabled by the very institutions that should have protected the vulnerable. How many women do you think have gone to their farm? Sarah's face is pale but determined. I've been keeping count since I returned. In the past 2 years alone, I've watched 7 widows arrive in town and then vanish into their web. Mary Patterson was the most recent. Before her there was Elizabeth Carter, Hannah Morrison, Ruth Caldwell. She pauses, her voice growing thick with emotion. Every one of them desperate, every one of them believing they had finally found salvation, and every one of them walking straight into hell while the whole town smiled and wished them well. Elena feels the weight of Mary Patterson's wedding ring in her coat pocket, its presence now carrying the gravity of evidence in what is clearly a far larger horror than she has ever imagined. The question that haunts her now isn't whether these women have found new lives, but whether any of them are still alive to be saved. Sarah's network of contacts proves more extensive than Elena has dared hope. Over the following days, they meet in secret with women who speak in whispers and glance constantly over their shoulders, survivors who have escaped the farmer brothers, trapped through luck, desperation, or the intervention of others who know the truth. Each account adds another layer to Elena's understanding of the systematic horror that thrives in Cedar Hollow's mountain shadows. Mary Catherine Webb is the first to agree to speak, though it takes 3 attempts before she can manage more than fragmented sentences. They meet her in an abandoned cabin 2 miles outside town, Sarah having convinced the traumatized woman that Eleanor can be trusted with her story. Mary Catherine sits with her back to the wall and her eyes fixed on the door, her thin frame swimming in clothes that once fit a healthier woman. I was there 11 months, she says, her voice barely audible above the October wind rattling the cabin's loose boards. Jeremiah told everyone I was his betrothed, that we were planning a Christmas wedding, but there was never going to be a wedding. There were 6 of us in that house when I left, kept in rooms barely big enough for sleeping pallets. Elena documents every detail as Mary Catherine describes the daily routine of forced labor and nightly visits from the brothers, how the women are rotated between different farms to prevent any one location from becoming too crowded with evidence. They had it planned like a business, Mary Catherine continues, her hands shaking as she speaks. Solomon kept books, writing down our names and where we came from and what property we'd signed over. Ezekiel handled the ones who tried to escape. And Jeremiah, he was the face they showed the world, all scripture and smiles, while he decided which of us would work the fields and which would serve other purposes. The financial scope of the operation becomes clearer when Sarah arranges for Elena to meet with Thomas Hartwell, a clerk at the county recorder's office who has been documenting suspicious property transfers for months. They meet in the basement of the Methodist Church after evening services, Hartwell's nervous energy filling the small space as he spreads papers across a dusty table. "Look at these deed transfers," he says, pointing to documents with a trembling finger. 11 properties in the past 3 years, all from widows, all signed over to the farmer brothers or their associates, properties worth thousands of dollars, transferred for nominal fees or debt forgiveness. Eleanor studies the papers by lamplight, noting how the signatures appear shaky, as if written under duress. The women signed these willingly? Hartwell's laugh is bitter. Define willingly. I've seen some of these women when they came to sign, bruised, terrified, accompanied by Ezekiel or one of his associates. But they signed, and that makes it legal, according to the law. He gathers the papers quickly, as if their very presence might summon unwanted attention. I've tried to interest the sheriff in investigating, but Sheriff Morrison receives generous donations for his re-election campaigns. The state prosecutor's office won't act without local law enforcement cooperation. It's a perfect system for them. Sarah has learned of a gathering planned for the following evening, one of the regular social events where the Farmer brothers identify potential new victims from among recently arrived widows or women facing financial difficulties. Elena insists on attending despite Sarah's objections, arguing that witnessing their selection process firsthand is essential to understanding their methods. "I'll be just another widow looking for a fresh start," Elena says, as Sarah helps her choose appropriate clothing for the deception. "They won't suspect a journalist from Nashville if I play my part correctly." The gathering is held at the Farmer brothers' main property, a sprawling house that sits like a crown atop the highest hill overlooking Cedar Hollow. Elena arrives with Sarah, who has agreed to attend as Elena's friend and sponsor in the community. The house is filled with the hollow sound of forced merriment, conversations that die when certain subjects arise and resume with deliberate lightness when the danger passes. Elena counts 12 women who appear to be recent arrivals or potential targets, their desperate hope visible in every gesture and glance. Jeremiah Farmer moves through the crowd like a predator selecting prey. His tall frame and commanding presence draw women's attention, despite the wrongness Elena can sense beneath his polished exterior. When he approaches her, Elena feels her skin crawl at the intensity of his scrutiny, as if he is evaluating livestock rather than making conversation. "Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it?" he says, his voice warm but his eyes calculating. "Sarah tells me you've recently suffered a loss. I'm sorry for your troubles, but perhaps the Lord has brought you here for a purpose." Elena plays her role perfectly, speaking of financial difficulties and the loneliness of widowhood, while Jeremiah nods sympathetically and quotes scripture about God's plan for providing comfort to the afflicted. She watches him work the same manipulation on other women, identifying those most desperate and isolated, those with property or savings worth acquiring. Solomon Farmer circulates with ledger books disguised as guest registers, asking innocent questions about women's backgrounds that Elena recognizes as intelligence gathering for their operation. The evening's most chilling moment comes when Ezekiel Farmer approaches her near the refreshment table, his massive frame blocking her path to the door. Unlike his brother's practiced charm, Ezekiel makes no effort to hide his predatory nature, studying Elena with eyes that seem to see through her deception. "You ask a lot of questions for someone just looking for companionship," he says quietly, his voice carrying an undertone of threat. "Sarah's been talking to you quite a bit. I hope she's not filling your head with stories that might give you the wrong impression about our family's hospitality." Elena maintains her composure despite her racing heart. "I'm simply trying to understand the community I might be joining. Surely that's natural for any woman considering such an important decision." Ezekiel's smile is cold as winter. "Of course it is. Just remember that some questions are better left unasked around here. We take care of our own in Cedar Hollow, but we don't tolerate troublemakers. You understand me, Mrs. Whitmore?" As Elena and Sarah walk back toward town through the autumn darkness, the weight of what she has witnessed settles over Elena like a shroud. The Farmer brothers aren't simply criminals preying on vulnerable women. They are the center of an entire economic and social system that has evolved to facilitate and hide their crimes. Every person at that gathering has known on some level what is really happening. Yet they participate in the charade because their own survival depends on maintaining the brothers' goodwill. "They're going to come for me," Elena says as they reach the boarding house, the certainty of it settling in her bones. Ezekiel suspected something tonight, and they won't risk exposure. Sarah nods grimly. "Then we need to work faster. How many more stories do you need before you have enough evidence to convince the authorities to act? Elena thinks of the terrified faces she has seen that evening, of Mary Catherine's trembling testimony, and of the property deeds that document systematic theft on an unimaginable scale. The question isn't whether she has enough evidence, but whether any amount of evidence will be sufficient to challenge a system that has made itself indispensable to an entire community's way of life. Elena's investigation has been progressing for 2 weeks when the first direct retaliation comes. She wakes to find her room at the boarding house ransacked, her notes scattered, and several pages missing from her journal. Mrs. Carmichael claims to know nothing about the intrusion, but her eyes wanted to meet Elena's as she mutters apologies about unreliable locks, and suggests perhaps it is time for Elena to consider moving on to more welcoming communities. The message is clear enough. Her presence has become inconvenient for people who prefer their secrets buried. That same morning, Sarah arrives at their planned meeting place with a bruised cheek and terror in her eyes. "They came to the schoolhouse yesterday after the children left," she says, her voice shaking as she touches the purple mark below her left eye. "Ezekiel and 2 men I didn't recognize. They said the school board had received complaints about my teaching, that parents were concerned about my influence on their children. They suggested I might be happier in another town, somewhere I could make a fresh start without the burden of unhappy memories." Elena feels rage building in her chest like a physical heat. "Did you report this to the sheriff?" Sarah's bitter laugh holds no humor. "Sheriff Morrison was one of the men with Ezekiel. He told me that outsiders had been filling my head with dangerous ideas, that I should remember how generous this community had been in giving me a second chance after my difficulties. He made it clear that second chances could be revoked if I continued associating with troublemakers. The systematic nature of their retaliation becomes evident over the following days, as Elena watches her sources disappear one by one. Mary Catherine Webb sends word through an intermediary that she can no longer meet, that her landlord has threatened eviction if she continues spreading lies about respected community members. Thomas Hartwell at the recorder's office suddenly becomes unavailable, his supervisor explaining that he has been reassigned to duties that keep him away from public records. Even the few townspeople who have shown Elena minimal courtesy begin crossing streets to avoid her, their faces carefully blank when she attempts conversation. Elena knows she needs irrefutable evidence, something so compelling that even the brothers' network of corruption cannot suppress it. Sarah, despite the mounting pressure against her, agrees to guide Elena to a location she has discovered during her desperate flight from the farmer property 2 years earlier. "There's a place in the mountains," Sarah says, as they prepare for the dangerous journey. "A clearing, about 3 miles northeast of their main house. I stumbled across it when I was running blind through the woods, trying to put distance between myself and them. What I saw there has haunted my sleep ever since." They set out before dawn, taking a circuitous route through dense forest to avoid the main roads where they might be spotted by the brothers' associates. The October morning is crisp and clear, but Elena feels the weight of unseen eyes following their progress through the trees. Sarah moves with the careful steps of someone who has learned to navigate hostile territory, checking constantly for signs of pursuit as they climb higher into the mountains. The clearing Sarah leads her to sits in a natural depression, surrounded by towering pines, hidden from casual view but accessible to those who know the path. At first glance, it appears to be simply another forest glade, but as Elena's eyes adjust to the filtered sunlight, she begins to see the subtle signs Sarah has discovered 2 years earlier. Irregular depressions in the earth arranged in rough rows, stones that have been deliberately placed rather than naturally deposited. Most telling of all, scattered fragments of fabric and metal that have survived the mountain weather. How many? Elena asks, her voice barely above a whisper as the full horror of the discovery settles over her. Sarah has been counting during their previous visits. I've identified at least 16 grave sites, maybe more. Some are older than others, judging by how settled the earth appears. This has been going on for years, Eleanor. Probably longer than either of us imagined. Eleanor kneels beside one of the more recent graves, her hands trembling as she brushes away fallen leaves to reveal a small metal button that once belonged to a woman's dress. The button is tarnished but intact, and etched into its surface is a delicate rose pattern that speaks of someone who once cared about beauty and elegance. She thinks of Mary Patterson, of Rebecca Thornton, of all the women whose names Sarah has recited like a litany of the lost. We need to contact federal authorities, Elena says, carefully placing the button in her satchel as evidence. This goes beyond local corruption. These are murders, and the local law enforcement is complicit. The federal marshals will have to act when presented with proof of a mass grave. But Elena's optimism proves tragically misplaced. When she travels to the federal courthouse in Knoxville and presents her evidence to the U.S. Marshal's office, she encounters a wall of bureaucratic indifference that seems insurmountable. Marshal William Thornfield, a portly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of perpetual impatience, listens to her account with obvious skepticism. "These are serious accusations, Miss Whitmore," he says, examining her photographs and notes with perfunctory interest. "But they're also accusations against prominent citizens with considerable influence in state political circles. The Farmer family has connections that reach all the way to the governor's mansion." Eleanor feels her last hope beginning to crumble. "Are you saying their political connections matter more than the lives of the women they've murdered?" Thornfield's expression hardens. "I'm saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and what you've presented could be interpreted in many ways. Unmarked graves in mountain country aren't unusual. People have been burying their dead in family plots for generations without formal records. Without bodies, without positive identification, without witnesses to actual crimes, there's no case that would survive legal scrutiny. The Marshal's final blow comes when he reveals the extent of the brothers' protection. I've received communications from Congressman Hartwell and Senator Morrison vouching for the Farmer family's character and expressing concern about harassment by outside agitators. These men carry considerable weight in Washington, Miss Whitmore. I'd advise you to be very careful about making accusations you can prove against people with the resources to defend themselves aggressively. Elena returns to Cedar Hollow with the bitter knowledge that justice through official channels is impossible. The corruption extends far beyond the mountain community, reaching into the highest levels of state and federal government. The Farmer brothers have built their operation not just on isolation and intimidation, but on a network of political obligations and financial dependencies that make them effectively untouchable. The final crushing blow comes 3 days after her return, when Sarah arrives at their meeting place, with tears streaming down her face and a prepared statement in her shaking hands. "They took my position at the school," she says, her voice breaking. "The school board met in emergency session and voted to terminate my employment immediately. But that wasn't enough for them. Reverend Clayton visited me last night with 2 members of the church council. They said I had 24 hours to publicly recant my lies about the Farmer family or face consequences that would extend beyond mere unemployment." Elena reads the statement Sarah has been forced to prepare, each word a betrayal of everything they have worked to expose. The document declares that Sarah has been mistaken in her previous claims, that her traumatic experiences have caused her to misinterpret acts of Christian charity as something sinister, and that she now recognizes the Farmer brothers as pillars of the community who deserve apology rather than accusation. They made it clear that if I don't read this publicly, they'll ensure I can never find work or shelter anywhere in the county, Sarah says, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her defeat. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so terribly sorry, but I can't fight them anymore. As Elena watches her only ally prepare to destroy their case in the name of survival, she feels the full weight of systemic corruption crushing her hopes for justice. The Farmer brothers have won, not through superior morality or legal right, but through the simple exercise of power over people who have no choice but to submit or be destroyed. Elena sits in her small room at the boarding house as November rain drums against the windows, staring at the collection of evidence that will never see the inside of a courtroom. Sarah's forced recantation has been delivered that morning at the church, her voice hollow as she reads words that betray everything they have discovered together. The few remaining townspeople who might have supported their cause melt away like shadows before dawn, leaving Eleanor isolated in a community that has chosen willful blindness over uncomfortable truth. She could return to Nashville, write sanitized stories about women's charitable societies and church social events, pretend she has never seen Mary Patterson's abandoned wedding ring or heard Mary Catherine Webb's broken testimony about 11 months of systematic brutalization. But as Elena sorts through her notes one final time, preparing to pack them away as evidence of her failure, she realizes that legal justice and moral truth are not the same thing. The federal marshals might refuse to act, the local authorities might remain corrupted, and Sarah might be forced to publicly deny what they both know to be true. Yet the fundamental reality remains unchanged. The Farmer brothers are murderers and slavers. Their crimes are documented in Elena's careful interviews and meticulous records. If the system will not deliver justice, then perhaps the system itself needs to be circumvented rather than appeased. Elena begins writing that night, not the careful legal brief she has hoped to present to federal authorities, but a comprehensive account of everything she has discovered in Cedar Hollow. She writes about Mary Patterson's wedding ring found in the forest clearing, about Sarah's harrowing escape and the women who remained trapped on the brothers' remote farms, about the hidden cemetery where victims are buried in unmarked graves. She documents the network of corruption that protects the brothers, naming Sheriff Morrison and Reverend Clayton and the federal marshal who has dismissed her evidence as politically inconvenient. Most importantly, she writes about the systematic nature of their operation, the careful selection of victims, and the community complicity that makes such horrors possible. When her account is complete, Elena makes multiple copies using carbon paper, storing them in different locations and preparing them for distribution to newspapers across Tennessee and beyond. If local justice has been purchased by political influence, then perhaps national attention can accomplish what federal marshals have refused to attempt. She also begins reaching out through carefully coded letters to women's organizations in Nashville, Memphis, and Atlanta, sharing information that will help them warn potential victims about the dangers lurking in Cedar Hollow's mountains. Sarah finds her 3 days later, arriving at the boarding house after dark, with fear and determination warring in her expression. "I heard you were still here," she says, glancing nervously at the shadows outside Elena's door. "I thought you'd given up and gone home after what I was forced to do at the church." Her voice carries shame and guilt that cut Elena to the heart, but also something else, a flickering ember of rebellion that public humiliation has not entirely extinguished. "I'm not leaving without you," Elena says simply. "And I am not leaving without making sure other women know what they are walking into when men like Jeremiah Farmer come calling with promises of security and second chances." She shows Sarah the copies of her comprehensive account, the letters she has prepared for distribution, and the network of contacts she is building beyond Cedar Hollow's corrupted borders. "We can't save the women who are already trapped, but we can make sure their stories are told and that future victims have warning. Sarah's composure cracks completely as she realizes Elena intends to continue fighting despite the overwhelming odds against them. "They'll destroy you for this," she whispers. "The brothers have resources and connections you can't imagine. They'll ruin your reputation, threaten your family, make it impossible for you to work anywhere in the South." Elena thinks of her late husband, of the preventable accidents she has been too late to investigate and expose, of all the stories she has left unwritten because they were too dangerous or politically inconvenient. "Then let them try," she says with quiet determination. "Some truths are worth the cost of telling them, and some fights are worth losing, if losing means the truth survives." The confrontation Elena has expected comes 2 weeks later, not in the form of legal papers or official warnings, but as a visit from Jeremiah Farmer himself. He arrives at the boarding house on a grey December morning, his imposing presence filling Elena's small room as Mrs. Carmichael reluctantly allows him entry. Gone is the false charm he has displayed at the social gathering. Now he faces Elena with the cold calculation of a predator whose territory has been challenged by something he cannot simply eliminate through force. "Miss Whitmore," he says, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience, "I understand you've been spreading stories about my family, stories that have caused considerable distress to members of our community who value peace and Christian charity above gossip and speculation." He studies her with eyes that seem to catalogue weaknesses and vulnerabilities. "I've come to offer you an opportunity to correct these misunderstandings before they cause irreparable harm to innocent people." Elena meets his gaze without flinching, recognizing this moment as the true test of everything she has fought to accomplish. "Mr. Farmer," she replies, her voice steady despite the danger radiating from him like heat from a forge. "The only misunderstanding here is your belief that truth can be silenced by threats and intimidation. Your crimes are documented, your victims' voices are recorded, and their stories will be told regardless of what happens to me." Jeremiah's facade of religious righteousness cracks completely, revealing the predator beneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, woman. This community depends on men like my brothers and me for its prosperity and stability. We provide employment, support the church, maintain order among elements that might otherwise become problematic. Your interference threatens the welfare of hundreds of innocent families." "Innocent families," Elena repeats, thinking of the women buried in unmarked graves and the survivors too terrified to speak truth aloud. "Is that what you call the widows you've murdered? The women you've enslaved on your remote farms? The community that looks the other way while you destroy lives for profit?" She stands facing him with all the moral authority of someone who has witnessed unspeakable evil and refuses to be silenced by it. "Your operation is finished, Mr. Farmer. Maybe not today, maybe not through legal channels, but finished nonetheless. The truth has a way of spreading despite the efforts of powerful men to contain it. Elena's prediction proves accurate, though the victory comes slowly and at great personal cost. Her comprehensive account, published in newspapers across the South and distributed through women's organizations throughout the region, creates a national scandal that even the brothers' political connections cannot suppress. Federal investigators, finally forced to act by public pressure and media attention, descend on Cedar Hollow and uncover evidence that leads to the prosecution of the Farmer brothers and their accomplices. The hidden cemetery yields the remains of 19 women, their identities established through personal belongings and dental records that confirm Elena's most horrific accusations. Years later, Elena will receive letters from women who have read her account and recognize the warning signs before falling into similar traps. From survivors who have found the courage to escape through networks established by her work, and from daughters of victims who finally learn the truth about their mother's disappearances. The Farmer brothers die in federal prison, their empire of corruption dismantled, and their methods exposed to prevent future atrocities. Justice has come, not through the system Elena has initially trusted, but through the persistent telling of truth that no amount of power or influence can ultimately silence. In the end, the voices of the dead have found their way to the living, and their stories have become the weapon that destroyed their destroyers.